Welcome, John. It's nice to see you again. I have to introduce you to our listeners and audience. Well, actually, for many of them, they'll know you already. But you are known as the godfather of Australian legal technology.
Yeah, okay. Well, to some, which sort of suggests I should be wandering around with a violin case with a machine gun in it, which I don't normally accompany. And I think it's just length, just been hanging around for so long. I think it's a bit like, a favorite old pub that nobody goes to anymore. It's just, there in the background, tolerated. It'll be mildly missed when they pull it down. So I think that's my role, sir, is just to.
I would beg to differ with that, John. I think you're a source of inspiration for many people in their careers in legal technology. You've helped many firms in terms of choices and steering away from some bad decisions and help with good decisions. I think there's an enormous amount of debt that the legal technology community actually owes you in the Aussie region. I think you've done some pretty amazing things.
Well, thank you, David. So let's actually qualify what I've actually done. I started the CIO forums a long time ago, which I guess is one legacy. So they still go on. Probably be doing a better job than when I ran them, but that's okay. And the wine tastings, I think that's really my major contribution to legal people, is trying to introduce them to a fun night tasting wines, which of course have come to a sad end in the last 2 years anyway.
Well, hopefully not for long. Hopefully we can sort of get to a position whereby I get those ones going. I know they're very well attended and very well liked, and you ran some conferences as well.
Oh, that's true.
So that's great. Well, I guess the reason why I wanted to chat to you today was for our listeners and audience was really around some research you've been doing, I guess, over the last year into how law firms are working through, IT decisions, some of the research and findings you've actually had through that. I mean, some interesting conversations we've had around it, but I thought not to steal the show, to actually, I guess, to talk around what kind of research you've done, what kind of firms, what kind of findings, things that people can take away and sort of utilize.
Okay, well, look, there's more than one type of research. One is just the ad hoc research and just talking to people, but we've, in a formal sense, we did a survey on the impact of COVID. That's probably about a year ago now, and we've updated that to some extent, just to revisited that, and also included some of that information in an article we provided to your esteemed publication. And the other one we do, which is probably out every 18 months, we do a legal tech survey, which is extremely comprehensive. And that's shared with the participants only, but the information that it contains is of relevance sometimes in the work we do, without sharing the names of the firms that participate, unless they agree to it, which hasn't happened as yet, to be honest. And I should qualify that when I talk about the survey and the research we do, it is very much with firms. There's about probably 30 firms above 100 users. So that doesn't mean to say we don't know about smaller firms, but the research we do tends to be with that group of firms, both international, but mostly national firms. And when I say national, that it does include some New Zealand firms. So that's the basis of it. And we've just pretty much concluded the latest update to the tech survey. But I would just preface that by saying, when the pandemic was about to start and I visited Melbourne, I met with about 20 different people, and I was pleasantly surprised when they turned up, because they were all having crisis meetings, business continuity meetings at the time. So we had a few postponements, but I was pleasantly surprised by seemingly how well prepared the majority of the firms were to deal with COVID. And some of them had put in, things like laptops to all, not very many, but they were certainly moving in that direction. So when we talk about, I guess, the changes that we've seen through COVID, and these are pretty well documented, so I'm no surprises here. The big win is remote working. And what's happened with remote working And the businesses generally were somewhat skeptical about how they would cope with remote working,
Yep.
and not just legal, of course. But what's been proven is that it actually works rather well. And we all know, and there's plenty of debate again, whether this remote working will continue, or flexible working, perhaps we should say, will it continue? And we strongly believe that, yes, it will. And just as well, seeing as I won't make any political observations here, but because of the latest sort of disaster with Omicron, it's just as well that we're prepared and know we can cope working remotely. So the other thing was that I would note is, and not surprisingly, businesses have a greater appreciation of IT now, because they realize the absolute importance. So if you look historically at the greatest areas of expenditure in a law firm, and probably applies to other businesses, it's usually people, premises, and IT. That would be the greatest, who would have the greatest budgets. But in the area of importance, traditionally it would have been the same thing: people, premises, and IT. But now what's been proven is that premises has dropped down the list. So it's people, IT, and possibly HR and communications would be, slightly more important than premises, because everyone's working quite comfortably in general without the premises. The other thing that would note is that, based on the survey, is that traditionally, again, the average percentage of revenue has long been in Australia 4%. It varies, and it will vary based on projects, etc. And the international, when I say international, UK and US has probably been more around 5%. That doesn't mean to say I should qualify this by saying Australian IT in legal is actually pretty good, probably better than its US and UK counterparts, despite the fact they may spend a little less. But now the average, and I just did a sum and averaged it out, is around 5%. So we've seen a 1% increase on average of expenditure in legal. And I guess that's not surprising, because what has happened is that to support remote work, there's a major purchase of laptops when you can get them, and other expenditure, particularly around security. And that would be one of the big changes, is COVID has driven a great awareness and need for better cybersecurity. Now that has been also driven by client requirements. So the two in combination, I think, have accelerated the need to be more conscious of the risks associated with cybersecurity and the greater expenditure. And without going into any greater detail, but that's certainly happened. We know that anecdotally by talking to people. We've assisted some firms with that, but it's a big change. I guess complementing that, if you like, or not surprisingly, there's been a decrease in the role of Citrix or similar products. Because if you've got a laptop, you don't want to be encumbered by having to connect to work remotely. You want the flexibility of having a laptop to work anywhere, whether you're connected or not connected. But now you're connected to the internet pretty much anywhere anyway. And Citrix still remains with some firms important, because there's certain applications, some practice management systems, without being specific, really require Citrix to work remotely. So those would probably be the major things that I would say that COVID has accelerated, and those changes are obviously going to be mostly permanent.
And what about, I'm interested, I guess, in the roles of CIOs. How have they seen changes in their roles over that time?
I think there's been again, this is based on the survey, there's been a gradual change in the reporting structures in firms where CIOs have been, perhaps reluctantly, but perhaps their contribution to a business has been received greater acknowledgement. So the reporting lines, which are quite diverse, but generally either to the COO or CEO, we've seen a slight increase in CIOs or heads of IT reporting to the CEOs. And that's, I guess that's partly acknowledgement of the importance of the role, of IT in general. again, I think coming back to security, the emphasis on security. The other big change which was happening before COVID was the move to cloud computing. So I think in general, and again, this is based on other surveys, there's a cloud first policy in many firms now. So if you want, if you want to buy some sort of new system and it's cloud based, that would be, acceptable now and preferable. And of course, the business themselves, and again, it's not just legal, but in general, there's been an acceptance that cloud computing is the future. So, and that brings some, a lot of benefits, particularly, law firms that like fancy offices and spend a lot of money on them. I mean, one thing they can now shed to some extent is the in-house computer room. And that also helps when you're moving premises, because it's one big chunk and a critical chunk that you don't have to spend so much time worrying about is, packing up the computer room overnight and moving it to, or relocating it somewhere. So there's a lot of benefits from cloud, not necessarily going into the financial aspects, but just using cloud computing. And that's changed internally, possibly the role of CIO, but I think the structure of IT departments reflect that outsourcing of infrastructure, etc. So you're not necessarily managing so much generally, but you can perhaps reallocate those resources to business needs, which is probably a good outcome. And I don't think that the size of IT departments in general have decreased, not looking again at the numbers, which is another measurement we do. In some cases, they've increased marginally. And of course, when you're talking about numbers, I mean, one thing we know about the legal profession is that, surprisingly, because many firms, I think maybe the majority, thought COVID was going to have somewhat of an impact on the bottom line. Well, in general, that's not been the case. We've seen numbers in law firms remain constant, and revenue, in some cases, maybe more than I'm aware of, has actually increased. And the firms that have, not surprisingly, there are some firms that have been impacted by COVID are the ones that have traditionally not spent on IT. They've been caught short and struggled to support remote work.
I mean, it's one thing that sort of occurred to me is the whole cultural side of changes as well around, an IT team, you've got the CIO, you've got an IT manager who mentors people in the business and makes sure they're on track and they're growing their careers and that sort of stuff, like particularly juniors and things. I mean, how has that been dealt with during this time?
Well, look, some firms, of course, have in IT anyway, and certainly when I was the CIO, have started to embrace remote working, but it does present challenges. But it's a recognition that many jobs can be done effectively, irrespective of location. You can hire people. It doesn't have to be people that can come into your office. They can work remotely. So I think, again, that's probably accelerated the fact that you can have a workforce working remotely. But we know it does present challenges. I mean, it's sort of this expression out of sight, out of mind. Well, when it comes to managing people, having a better recognition perhaps of their contribution and their abilities, you don't always have that level of appreciation when you're not actually seeing people. And look, we're social animals, it's generally accepted. Most of us like to meet up with our colleagues now and again. And that applies, of course, not just in IT, to the whole legal profession and others. I mean, we like occasionally to be able to meet with our colleagues and people who are probably our friends. And there's no doubt that, I mean, video conferencing is not a great substitute for face-to-face contact.
Not at all.
And the fact that, you can have a more casual, but sometimes very profitable interaction with colleagues just in passing, as opposed to some constant formal meetings where you sit around and look at each other on a video camera and, probably nod off discreetly if you're getting bored or whatever.
Well, it's quite forced, isn't it? I mean, I guess that's another big change that's coming to play as well with the legal profession, because, I mean, what they're now being forced to do is actually be video stars and be on video and actually do these meetings, conference calls and all sorts of stuff where they might be able to sort of sit down, have a cup of coffee beforehand, get to know a bit about the client and things. It's just straight into it, and it's actually performing on the video.
I couldn't help but think, because for this occasion I put on a shirt, not wearing a t-shirt, which is basically my, what I've been living in. And I think that's the case for many people. Does it reflect a permanent casualization of attire when you're not having to dress up formally, when you're doing a video conference? You're probably a little more relaxed about it. Clients obviously are doing the same thing. So, I would imagine there's a general acceptance of this slightly more informal approach that video can bring. And generally it's fairly effective, right? I mean, you don't actually have to meet with somebody to have a constructive meeting. It may not be quite as easy, but you can still do it. And I think that again is something that'll remain with us. And one of the things we know is the rise of things like Zoom, which I think in legal, Teams will be the predominant product. Well, we know that's the case, but the acceptance of video conferencing, and I can tell you when I was working as a CIO and introduced video conferencing, the reluctance of people to use it as a default, was used to surprise me. It was like, I could always imagine their initial reaction to telephones. What, I've got to talk to this thing? Don't I have to meet somebody? And video is the same. We talk to people face to face, we see them. So I never could understand what the big deal was changing from, a telephone call to a video conference. Well, now it's just accepted, right? There's no debate anymore or reluctance. People just accept it and get on with it. For better or worse. But it's been good for Zoom, and it's good for Microsoft. Just straying a little bit, but many firms are using both Zoom and Teams. But I've long believed, and what I see happening with Teams, because law firms have it anyway, because of the Microsoft Office, and we're all stuck with Microsoft, love them or not. And Microsoft have recognized they're on a winner with Teams. And the integrations, their own integrations, the functionality they're adding, plus the other integrations from other third parties, is quite significant. And why not use Teams when you've already got it anyway? And people are using it in quite, not totally surprising, seeing as the functionality is there, but they're using it in quite diverse ways. Or not me though, but I've seen it and been pleasantly surprised by how people are using it.
So I guess, John, one of the questions, on some people, CIOs' minds, and I guess, practice managers, CIOs' minds, and execs' minds in law firms is the top 3 things on a shopping list for IT. So what are the top 3 things you're seeing that people are actually looking at right now?
The primary one comes back to security. I think what we're seeing is more sophisticated management, again, largely driven by clients, but more sophisticated management of their networks. So they're not just, and a lot of that's outsourced to specialists, but you can't get away now with just filling in, when you're responding to something from a business, particularly a financial company, a client. You can't just tick boxes anymore. It's quite a painful process, actually. Not that I have to do it, but it's to respond and prove that you are compliant with what their expectations are around security and risk management. So that, I think that would be one of the top of mind things for CIOs. And you're looking, at people getting ISO qualifications or compliance, because that helps them with their, meeting client expectations. I think the other thing, look, this is perhaps I can just take on it, is that journey to the cloud. There's still a certain reluctance internally with some firms, but broadly, again, because the clients accept it, then it makes it easier for IT to make that migration. I think generally it's been recognized, but I still think that's probably where there's room, for CIOs to make that journey. And the big gap for the legal firms that we're talking about here or referring to is practice management. there's no real cloud-based practice. There's hosted, but no real cloud-based practice management, such as there is in document management. So look, those are the two things that I would suggest. Maybe now there's, and this is not just IT, but having spoken to a few people, is staff retention, because there's, I'm told, quite good money being paid to capture good staff by non-legal.
So, good. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and suddenly you're faced with losing, and a CIO may be faced with losing good staff. And the problem with, incumbency is to be able to pay people more if you're bringing in somebody externally without offending your incumbents, because there's a price you pay for being, having a long, being any business for a long period of time, is your salary inevitably falls behind what the market is prepared to pay. And I think at the moment, at least with IT and maybe other professions, I think the same with lawyers, is that the people at legal firms are finding there's greater attraction, if motivated purely by finances, is to go outside of legal. And there's lots of big IT companies prepared to pay.
Oh, I've definitely seen them. I've seen, increases 20, 30% in terms of what people used to get paid, or where they're getting, what they're getting paid right now. So it's some really, and there's a lot of companies coming to Australia that are looking to actually expand their wings out here and do things and attract great talent. Yeah,
and look, you'd be you'd observe this more than I do because of your role as in recruitment. So that would probably be a concern, I think, for CIOs, and maybe in fact they're tempted by going somewhere else. Who knows? Maybe getting an opportunity to move and to get more money.
I mean, it's interesting because I've had conversations with different people in the industry about having like a very solid program in place of having juniors, like bringing juniors up through the ranks. So, going to universities, having feeder schemes into universities and scholarships and whatnot, to actually then encourage people to actually then come into law firms, professional services in the IT area and be mentored up.
Well, look, I think part of the problem that legal has is that IT is a comparatively small part of a legal firm. And to provide variety of opportunities in legal IT can be a challenge, particularly, perhaps in smaller firms. So what IT can offer, legal IT can offer, is variety.
Yeah.
So there's less chance of being totally stuck in sort of one role, looking after one, having one responsibility, as does happen in much larger businesses, or IT specific companies, where you're stuck in one area. Maybe you get to move occasionally, but if you're particularly with technical ability, you tend to be pigeonholed to some extent. So that happens less in legal, and I think that's one of the attractions of working in legal IT. Yeah. But again, and I know from personal experiences that there's a limit to what you can provide people. So the normal introduction to legal, whether people, somebody's qualified or not, or what their qualifications are, is often through the help desk.
Yeah.
And anybody who's good doesn't want to stay on a help desk. They want to, 2 years, I used to think was a maximum. If I had a good person, I could get 2 years, then they would either hopefully provide opportunities within the IT department and retain them, or I would expect they would go. So maybe you got 3 years, you're doing pretty well. But the best people do go. So there's not a lot you can do about that, really.
No, not much at all. Well, John, yeah, I mean, it's an interesting one because, I guess the year ahead will be a bit challenging. There's a lot of change on afoot, and I guess what advice would you give to our, I guess, listeners and audience out there around next year in terms of their firms?
I'm not sure I'm the best to give any advice, David. Well, I think there's an opportunity that's being created by COVID.
Yeah,
is for in IT, is to the importance of IT having been proven for the business survival, is to build on that, and if they've earned greater recognition from themselves in the IT department, hopefully to build on that, to have a broader involvement in the firm. Because one of the ironies about IT in most, well, a large percentage of firms, where they tend to be overlooked, is that IT probably has the greatest understanding of a business than any other part of a legal firm or businesses, particularly because they are involved in virtually every aspect of the business. You know, particularly if you're doing, you know, you've got business analysts, etc., who have sometimes a very intimate knowledge, you know, next to the lawyers, of course, but an intimate knowledge of what the firm needs. And I think that, well, I know that to a large extent that is overlooked. So when you look at, you know, the structures of legal firms, and maybe not just legal, but again, legal firms, is that often the CIO or the head of IT doesn't have a seat at the table. Despite the importance of IT to the business, and the fact that without IT you don't have a business anymore, and maybe, you know, for you know, turn the lights off and see what happens. Well, why not recognize their contribution, give it more recognition, and realize that, you know, reporting to the CEO through a proxy, which is often the CIO, irrespective of how good the CIO is, reporting through a proxy is not necessarily ideal. So I think businesses could leverage, and some do, could leverage off the knowledge of the CIO, a good CIO, better. So maybe that's an opportunity for you know, IT professionals, is to get a greater recognition within the companies or the firms they work for.
Brilliant. John, thanks very much for your time today. It's always a pleasure to catch up, and I'm sure our readers will get lots of value from our chat.
Thanks, David.